Hey folks, welcome back to For Starters. We wanted to pick up on a thread from one of our recent conversations about AI with a little bit more information or insight from our experience in terms of how these AI companies that are getting so much press these days are actually getting funded, and perhaps taking it a step further, what that means for the current state of how companies are getting funded by the venture capital and innovation ecosystem. So just to set the context for the conversation, there really are, as I mentioned in our prior video, a couple of different broad groupings of AI companies. There are the very large, fundamental large language model companies that are providing essentially the massive resource base of data, right? And so these are companies that, you probably know the names of. It's OpenAI, it's Anthropic, et cetera. And there's, half a dozen of these companies, and in funding these companies, of course, folks who were fortunate and intelligent enough to place bets with them a couple of years ago are doing extremely well, I think. But in terms of the recent funding rounds, they've been largely defined by very, very large technology companies, Microsoft for OpenAI, for example, but each of the large technology companies out there, Microsoft, Apple, et cetera, are kind of placing their bets with one of these big LLM companies and forging very large partnerships. And in fact, with very interesting financing terms, I think there's certain elements of, for example, the Microsoft and OpenAI deal that are not just a traditional non-control investment. There's certain provisions that essentially look like more of a very large corporate partnership. We can delve into those in another video, but essentially for these large LLM companies, you are seeing them pair off with one of the big technology majors. And then, of course, if there's other investors around those rounds or other folks who are able to get into it, that's great for them to a certain extent, but it's really defined by these massive partnerships, which leaves the other type of AI companies, which are the much broader ecosystem of companies that are now sprouting up on top of these large models and these data sets that are bringing AI technologies to very specific applications, whether it be within healthcare, within financial technologies, energy, et cetera. And these are the ones that we're most concerned with taking a look at these days. We think that the consolidation of the kind of large language model ecosystem was extremely rapid, and not to say that there won't be further innovation there, but the large players are quite clearly set, extremely well capitalized and hard to compete with. Now the ecosystem, the flora and fauna on top of the coral reef, if you will, are really coming up, and those companies are getting funded in much more traditional fashions by venture capital firms, angel investors, family offices, et cetera. And so that's a little bit more of a traditional approach. Now, what this leads me to is an observation as to how venture capital funding is changing, perhaps in very significant ways from 17 years ago when I started doing this, and in some of the yesteryears of venture capital. And one of the key things that used to be a big feature of the ecosystem was the idea of following smart money. A lot has changed in the last couple of decades, but if you look back to right after the dot-com bubble, most venture firms were quite small. Even the largest of the venture firms were a few $100 million at most. And so those, for when looking at either any kind of company, those funds would build syndicates around the rounds, particularly the later and more expensive rounds. And if you had a relationship with those funds, or were perhaps even an investor, an LP in those funds, you might be able to get an allocation into those rounds. So people would say, like I have a position with X, Y, and Z VC, or, my network is really good, so I can get in, so I can follow that smart money. In a lot of ways, that has changed. So as the quantum of funds, assets under management has changed so materially over the last few years in the post-SoftBank Vision Fund environment, where now your Sequoias and Andreessens and others, the really big top 50 or so funds in the space, maybe more funds, are operating at the multi-billion-dollar level, it suddenly really changes the dynamic of following smart money. I'm not saying that it is impossible to get into those rounds, and there are certainly lots of reasons why you might get into a Series A or B or C being led by one of the big venture firms, but there really has to be a good reason. You're going to be very value add. You have an extremely tight relationship with that fund, because otherwise, in today's dynamics, those Series Bs, that $20 or $30 million round, that large fund that's managing $4 or $5 billion, they have to buy every last share. In fact, they may even be working with the founders to buy secondaries in those companies to essentially add to their ownership. The idea is the big funds now have to purchase more ownership, and they're much less focused on building a syndicate in order to subscribe an entire round. This is a big feature of the AI ecosystem, because the AI ecosystem is really attractive to folks, and people are trying to find ways to get in. And I hear all the time now as I'm out, talking to folks, oh, I'm able to get into this deal. I was able to follow this particular fund in, and my concern there is, if it's really a deal that the funds like, it should be very hard to get into. And so I think as we see this AI ecosystem start to differentiate and we start to see better assets and not so good assets, we just need to really query and be really careful about the idea of following smart money into those deals. For the largest of the companies, those deals are now dominated by these very large technology companies. For the smaller companies in the AI field, you're getting a lot of interest from these very large funds, and those funds neither need nor necessarily want to build a large syndicate and bring a lot of other people into the party. So the changing dynamics of the old idea of following smart money, which used to be a real mainstay of the way that everybody else used to get involved in VC, I think that's changed a lot in the last few years.